It's an absolute privilege to be back in Japan. The last time I was here, I was celebrating my 25th wedding anniversary with my husband on a tour of Japan. He's never forgotten it. I was here too not long after the tsunami and went to Sendai and down to Matsushima and visited many of the people who had been most affected. As I was telling colleagues last night, I have never forgotten the challenges that I saw Japan face, nor the determination that Japan showed to deal with this. I wanted to talk to you, though, about some of the issues that I see from a foreign policy perspective, and I will weave into that this whole issue of Brexit. The quantity and the intensity and the complexity of the issues that are faced now in this more interconnected world are truly daunting. They're political, they're civil wars, they're regional conflicts, there are simmering disputes. We can reel off a list. So we need to evaluate now, in this modern time, whether we have the tools that we really do need to tackle these problems. And if not, how do we develop them? What are the things we're going to have to do in the future? How are we going to work in ways that are going to really not just understand and reflect upon, but address and answer the questions that we face? Is our diplomacy then truly in retreat, or are we going to become more creative in what we do? And I think, and Chairman Sasakawa said this when he used the words comprehensive approach, that this is something that we now need to redefine and rethink in terms of what we should do. You see, too often we're not able to pull the resources and the commitments together to address not just the problems that we see, but the underlying causes and all of the effects of those problems. We do get close to it. I can recall the work we did in the Horn of Africa in both dealing with the problems and challenges off the coast of Somalia, piracy, often perpetrated by boys aged 14 to 15, with the promise of $10,000 if they could get hold of a ship, versus the prospect, if they were lucky, of $1 a day. I've seen too that if you can address not just the challenge that they create in their piracy on the sea, but the difficulty for these young people on the land and the prospects for their future. If you can work with the African Union troops when they move out Al-Shabaab and those who would cause terror in a country like Somalia, you need to replace it with those who can provide education, healthcare, and jobs. You need to work up and work out how you're going to put education at the heart of a strategy for young people in places of conflict or post-conflict. Education at the heart of the Somalian strategy led to the slogan, "Give up your guns and go to school." A simple way of trying to prevent children becoming child soldiers, or those who have become so, returning to being young people at learning and play. The point is, you have to interweave it all together. You have to create the circumstances where you're able to deal with all of the issues and see the connections. Many people look at parts of the world, and Iraq is probably a good example, where without an investment strategy in the broadest sense of investment, it's difficult to work out how to support a country in the longer term. Afghanistan too, 10-year strategies have turned into 20-year strategies. And anywhere in the world that you look, whether it's conflict or challenge, everybody has to think long term. There are no places where a solution will be easily done in weeks or months or even a few years. And that requires the international community to rethink and reconnect. Not that the UN, the EU, ASEAN, the African Union, the Arab League, all of the nations collaborating in any event, the G20 and the G7 as well, don't think like that. But somehow the interwoven nature of the problems that need to be faced needs to be really dealt with by thinking carefully about what needs to happen. There are in too many places people who say we should move to democracy and think democracy means having an election and then that's it. And I have argued with leaders all over the world to say democracy is much, much more. That an election is the cherry on the icing on the top of the cake. And elections work because they allow you not only to bring people in, but to throw them out. And elections work if they're allowed to happen unhindered and free, and to give people choices. Democracy is much, much more than one event. It's everything that leads up to that event and everything that follows. And interweaving what I call deep democracy into a framework of a comprehensive approach is, in my view, where we have to go, and where we have to go together. Because it brings me to the obvious second point, which is that of collaboration. I cannot think of an issue, from climate change to energy needs, from development requirements to trying to solve the conflict in Syria or dealing with what's happening in Yemen, to dealing with North Korea, to thinking about how to examine the rise of China, to what Russia may be doing in Ukraine, to every issue, whatever position you take on it. I can think of no issue that does not require collaboration. You have to work together. It's especially relevant, of course, as I stand here as the UK has decided in one aspect of its collaboration to think differently. But I'm also conscious when I say that if you ask in many democracies, many countries, and it's certainly true in Britain, how far people want to engage in development support and development aid, it comes low on the list of what people think, because the benefits to them are less obvious. And when you look at the American election and you see the Republican candidate, who is hugely popular in many parts of America, querying the role of NATO, America's place in the world, what the role of the UN should be, and supporting UK in its Brexit journey, that there are many politicians who are now saying that the traditional mechanisms by which we have collaborated need at best to be rethought, or at worst to be undone. We can talk about this being a sort of populism, and I'm sure that will also play out in the discussions that we have here. What I call slogan solutions to deep problems. It's easier to be against something than for it. It's simpler. Reducing the complex to a soundbite. But unfortunately, and it's been the case for a long, long time, this is not new, it can appeal to people who feel that their lives are not what they would wish them to be. People who feel fed up with what we call elites or experts. It was even said in the Brexit campaign, we've had enough of experts. People who feel that they have not gained from our interconnected world in the same way. People who feel that their lives and the lives of their children will not get better if we continue on a current course. And those are really significant and important questions as politicians and others grapple with the question of how do we get support to deal with this range of issues and problems which need to be dealt with in an interconnected and collaborative way. Not least because, as everyone here knows, if you don't deal with the problems, you don't support your own people as effectively as you might. Helping to deal with security issues, helping to support people into a better economy has a benefit to those countries who do so, whether it's through trade, whether it's through security, whether it's the capacity of people to live safely, to be able to travel, to enjoy the benefits of working, living, visiting their closest or their furthest neighbours. An increasingly fragile world, a collaboration that needs to happen, and being able to work together is how we're going to try and solve the problems of the future. When I think about my country then, it's true, and as the Deputy Ambassador said, we are and have always been an outward-facing nation. The problem, as I've already indicated, is for many people life has not moved ahead in the way that they might have wished. For some, the challenges of local communities, what's happened to their local healthcare, how they feel about their job prospects, that wages have stagnated, that there are not the opportunities for housing, that they don't get the chance to find ways to improve their standard of living. All of these things are relevant, they are important, they are what people believe, and in many cases true, this is what is happening. It's also, as you see it in the American election, a huge part of the appeal from those who feel they have not benefited in the way that others have from an outward-looking society. So we have, as a nation, in thinking about our relationships as an outward-facing country, to deal with this. The Prime Minister needs to ensure, and will want to ensure, that we continue to face outwards. Because while there will be some in the whole Brexit debate who would wish to pull the drawbridge up, for those of you who remember the way castles were built in Europe especially, drawbridges were the way you stopped people entering your castle. And there are those who would wish to see that happen in Britain. The vast majority of people do not. They want to see an outward-facing Britain, but not connected to an institutional framework called the European Union. And so Brexit, and the interpretation of that phrase is going to be the challenge of the next 2 years. And in many other countries, this way of interconnecting is going to be extremely important when we think about the challenges that we're facing regionally and internationally. So even whether you're connected with an institutional framework like the European Union, or whether you are collaborating as a group of nations, bilaterally, in groups, whether you're part of a looser grouping, whatever the framework is that you're working in, we're going to have to get smarter and faster and better at what we do. I do not advocate the end of the formal collaborations that we have, but I think we need to get quicker and more able to bring those collaborative processes to work on some of the biggest problems that we've got right now. Sometimes when you work in a framework, it means you can't be as quick as you want to be. And finding ways to improve that is going to matter. Because actually, so many areas need solutions as quickly as possible. They need politicians to be able to work together to find the best solution or the best way forward. And the frameworks need to exist to do that. So I want to see that collaboration being rethought, both by the institutional frameworks that we currently have, and by, if you like, the shudder that has happened as a result of Brexit, to make sure that we don't lose the best of that collaboration and make sure that we think about it in the long term. You see, there's nothing that we can do now that can be done alone, and there's nothing that we need to do now that can be done short term. We have to think about 20 to 30-year timeframes to see failing states or desperate situations turn round. And we have to do it together and work on those issues together. As you in Japan think about your neighborhood, you will see lots of opportunities for collaboration with your partners here and further afield. And you will see those challenges that you're most concerned about right now, whether that's where China is going in the future, whether that's what to do about the problems of North Korea. All of this is about investment for the long term, and investment in new collaboration that can make that work effectively. From my own experience, it's about finding new ways of doing it. I was involved in a lot of negotiations. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. I'm going to focus on the ones that worked, for obvious reasons. But when I think about what we were able to do in Serbia and Kosovo, with two prime ministers in a room with me over a very long period, to try and address one of the most deep-rooted conflicts at a time when mass graves were still being discovered as we were meeting. When people would talk about a battle that took place in 1389 as if it was yesterday. And in a situation where the two prime ministers existed, where one was a country and the other believed it wasn't a country, where one had many supporters who regarded it as a nation, and yet even within the European Union, several countries who did not. When the red lines we bumped up against were that one should be treated as a country and the other felt it should not. And yet we managed to create not an Ashton plan, which was actually what they wanted, but their own plan to help them support the people into a better life. It's the beginning, not the end, but it was an important beginning. And even now, when I speak with the prime ministers of both nations, the work that they did then and the intensity of the way they worked, quietly, confidentially, nothing ever leaked, no one ever spoke outside until it was all over. But many sessions, 14 or 15 hours long, enabled them to be supported into their own agreement. The pull of the European Union mattered. The collaborative approach of the European Union nations that said the prize at the end of all this for all of you is to be part of us. But not only that, the willingness of people to rise above and to be the statesmen that these two men truly, truly were. And perhaps the most obvious of all, the Iran talks, where 4 years was spent, certainly of my life, in negotiations every month with the Iranians, with the support of what we called the P5+1 or the E3+3. I will say to you very clearly that without Russia and China, as well as the others, we would not have had an agreement. They were just as important as the US or the French or the Germans or the British. But also, and this is what I really want to say, so was Japan, so was South Korea, so was India, so was Pakistan, countries who were in the outer circle of willing us to succeed. And this country was especially important in helping us to work through what nuclear cooperation with Iran might look like in the future. Japan has always been willing to work with us on issues from the Middle East, where you've always had an envoy, to the Iran nuclear talks. And it's by that collaboration and long-term work that it gets done. There were many, many countries that I would speak to at the end of each round of talks, and others would speak to engage them in support of an effort that did, in the end, pay off. So, working out how we're going to collaborate, deciding what we're going to do, to keep a process on track, to make sure that we're being inventive and creative, I think these are going to be the best of the future. And finally, just to make an obvious point, we have got to stop talking about soft and hard power as if it's one thing or another. We've got to start thinking about the spectrum of what we do. I think sanctions, by the way, are hard power, not soft power, not least because done well, they have a dramatic effect on the country that's actually taking the sanctions, as well as the country who is being sanctioned, because you are putting your own economy on the line. But beginning to think about the spectrum of engagement and isolation, of when it is we engage, which is usually the better approach, and when it is, sadly, the time to isolate. When it's the time to move around on how you support people going through dramatic change, but how you make it clear what you are not prepared to support in leaderships that do not wish to give the people what they deserve. Linking economics and politics together, making sure that we understand how economic issues are often the driving force of the political voice, whether it's young people across the southern neighbourhood of Europe who need jobs and a future, whether it's people who feel that life has not delivered for them the way it's delivered for others, whatever the means or the reasons that exist, economics meets politics is absolutely crucial if we are to understand the way that our world will work in the future. So the toolkit for diplomats, the spectrum of engagement, the need to rethink our collaboration not to throw out things that work well, but to add to them and to become even more creative. And most of all, to recognise we have to work in a comprehensive manner for the long term. If we can do that, we can solve anything. And as none of us know what the future will throw up, and none of us could have seen the last few years coming, Brexit changed any thought that I could understand what would happen in my own country. But I can remember when I started my job as High Representative, I could not have predicted the Arab Spring. I did not see what might happen in the South China Seas. I did not see what might happen in the change of leadership in North Korea. And nobody predicted the fragmentation that we see and the horror of Syria and so on. So we don't know what the future holds. We cannot predict it. But what we do have to do is prepare for it. And that means being flexible and smart and clever and collaborative and long-term in our thinking.